And so today we have Dr. Amanda Hall, and she is at the incoming assistant professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And we have as our discussant, Jonathan Fenderson, who's an associate professor of African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, and he is a former fellow of ours. So he will lead the discussion in the Q&A section. So let me tell you a little more about Amanda. She recently completed her postdoctoral fellowship at Northwestern University in the Black Studies Department. She is, as I mentioned, incoming assistant professor of history at the University of California, Santa Barbara. And she is currently writing a book on the Black-led global anti-apartheid movement.
Thanks so much, Allison. And thank you to the BMRC for supporting my research this summer. I think one of the main things that this fellowship showed me is that the Chicago Land Repositories are a great place to do Black internationalist scholarship. And my presentation today will hopefully show you how I have incorporated my summer research into my larger project on Black-led anti-apartheid organizing. And thank you to Dr. Jonathan Fenderson for being my discussant. I am very much looking forward to the conversation. So my title today is A Child is Dying in Soweto. And I will begin by reading from some writing that I did based on sources that I found from the Columbia College archives this summer. What kind of world did South African exile Dennis Brutus see from his office in Northwestern's University Hall, where he taught English from 1971 to 1985? Brutus was a well-traveled political visionary, anti-apartheid poet, and sports activist, whose far-reaching Black internationalist framing of freedom was as big and broad as his beloved wide-brimmed spectacles. In 1973, as he sat down at his desk to write his poem Sharpeville, depicted on the right, did he stop once or twice to stand and stretch? Did he peer out of his window, choosing the sky to rest his eyes from a table mountained with student papers, diary notes, and unrelenting stacks of invitations? From his window, what could the former political prisoner of Robben Island see, both physically and politically, in every direction? From his west was the village of Skokie, where racists passed discriminatory laws in the daytime and wore white hoods at night. One wonders what the optics were during his 1979 poetry reading at its public library. If he allowed his gaze to travel some 15 miles south by public transit, he would have seen Chicago's new Negroes running numbers in Bronzeville and Southside girls jumping rope until the streetlights came on. Due north curled miles of coastline that carried him to the University of Wisconsin-Madison for a speech at the All-African People's Union Conference. To his immediate east rose and fell the glimmers of Lake Michigan, an expanse of deep marine blue that only turned turquoise like Cape Town's oceanic coast during the summer's hottest days. Like the Atlantic's hills and gullies, Chicago's waterfront held its own beauties and terrors. It remembered how Eugene Williams's joy turned to fear moments before his racist murder in 1919 after he crossed Lake Michigan's white color line aboard a makeshift raft. Such a vista might have reminded Brutus of a view from Robben Island, where he served a prison term for his anti-apartheid sports activism. Sport, whether recreational or professional, could get you jailed or worse among the waters and lands of apartheid. Looking out from Evanston, Brutus could recognize that the lands of America, just like those of Aotearoa and Azania, remained colonized. This is reflected in his 1984 A Friendly Question to the Native people of the American continent, which asked, "My fellow oppressed, by what name shall I call you?" His Black radical vision was not only focused on the present and the proximate, but on the past and the far. So this presentation will probe the ways that anti-apartheid sports activism linked Black Chicago and African America to Black Australia and New Zealand and to South Africa, all land shaped by anti-Black racism and white settler colonialism. So my presentation is about this Black anti-apartheid organizing against South Africa's rugby teams across the three places that I mentioned. It shows that African-led apartheid opposition dovetailed with and fortified indigenous anti-colonial struggles. And in African America, it elevated opposition, left opposition specifically, to the Reagan administration. So I'm going to go over the origins of the sports boycott and the Black Pacific boycotts, which really set the stage for the U.S. movement. I won't get to cover the Caribbean boycotts in this presentation, but I put it up here to let you know that it is a part of the narrative, and so is the 1984 Olympics, but we'll talk about that later. So the international ban on South African sport began chiefly with the agitation of African, Indian, and colored South Africans under the leadership of Dennis Brutus. Brutus was from Rhodesia, but when he was a child, his parents moved to Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape of South Africa, which is on the Indian Ocean side of South Africa. And this was a region that had a long tradition of Black activism against apartheid. Brutus attended the University of Fort Hare, where Professor Z.K. Matthews served as his mentor. And Matthews was also Nelson Mandela and Oliver Tambo's teacher. These are prominent leaders in the African National Congress, which was the primary liberation organization. And Brutus was a cricket player, but he was also colored, or he was at least classified as colored under apartheid law. And that prevented him from playing organized cricket on any of the existing teams because those teams were all white. So he founded the South Africa Sports Association, the SASA, as an alternative to all white sporting bodies. In 1961, the South African Security Police banned Brutus for his anti-apartheid sports advocacy, particularly as his organization, the SASA, started to influence international matches. Because what the organization said was that as long as apartheid law stands, no one should play in South Africa. No international sporting group should come to South Africa. In 1962, he co-founded the South African Non-Racial Olympic Committee. And this was to internationalize existing efforts to isolate South Africa from global sporting communities. And I have like a letterhead from SANROC on there. It's also known as SANROC. So as SANROC's president, Brutus's first task was to attend a meeting of the International Olympic Committee in Germany. And there he intended to demand that South Africa be expelled from the 1964 Tokyo Olympics because of its policy of apartheid. However, Portuguese policemen intercepted Brutus on his way to this meeting, and they returned him to South African authorities. Brutus tried to escape arrest, but a policeman shot him in the back as he ran away. He bled out on Johannesburg streets for about 30 minutes before he received medical care. Brutus survives. He was tried under the Suppression of Communism Act and jailed on Robben Island for 9 months, where he was put into solitary confinement and forced to perform hard labor. But while Brutus was incarcerated, other members of SANROC continued to push for an Olympic exclusion of South Africa. And in 1963, the Olympic Committee did expel South Africa, preventing their participation in the 1964 Olympic Games. When Brutus learned that South Africa had been banned by the IOC, which is the International Olympic Committee, he was caged in a cell next to Nelson Mandela, where both celebrated the victory. Upon Brutus's release from prison, he signed an exit visa, which denationalized him and forbade him from ever returning to the apartheid republic. From exile in England and later in the United States, Brutus continued organizing against apartheid by building an international sports campaign. He reestablished SANROC in London. In 1967, he toured the United States and Canada under the auspices of the A. Philip Randolph Institute and the American Committee on Africa. He testified before the UN Special Committee on Apartheid and the House Subcommittee on Africa that Congressman Charles Diggs chaired. And he made a special appeal that challenged US athletes and sports bodies to use their influence to suspend South Africa from the 1968 Mexico City Olympic Games. And this is just a flyer on the right. from his speaking tour. And on the left is an example of an exit visa. People would sign this if they wanted to leave South Africa under the condition that they would never return, specifically racialized people, not white people. While Brutus was leading Sandrock, African leaders were also organizing within the Organization of African Unity, the OAU, against apartheid sport. In 1966, more than 30 African member states formed the Supreme Council of Sports in Africa to build international consensus for a robust and continued sports isolation of South Africa. This organization, the Supreme Council, was aligned with the Olympic Project for Human Rights. This is Harry Edwards' organization. And the Supreme Council threatened an African boycott of the 1968 Games if the Olympic Committee permitted an all-white South African team to play. Caribbean, non-aligned, socialist and communist countries joined the African nations in their stance, and they also threatened a boycott. Facing boycott and disorder at the Games, the IOC acquiesced to the threat and expelled South Africa from the 1968 Olympics. African-American athletes representing the Olympic Project for Human Rights still made a stance. Track athletes Tommy Smith, John Carlos, and white Australian Peter Norman all sported the Olympic Project for Human Rights badge on their jackets on the 200-meter award podium. Smith and Carlos raised their fists in the Black Power salute, an image that press agencies circulated globally, but at the time it was very condemned, and they were condemned, all of them. Over the next decade, the OAU and the Supreme Council on Sport used Olympic boycotts against states that had second or third-party complicity with apartheid. The most notable example of this was perhaps in 1977, when the Supreme Council on Sport members, which represented at least 30 African states, boycotted the Montreal Olympics after New Zealand participated in a rugby tour of South Africa only days after the Soweto uprisings. And the Soweto uprisings was a moment when students were protesting apartheid laws. Young students, children, were protesting apartheid laws, and the government massacred almost 100 students in response to their peaceful protest. So the IOC refused to expel New Zealand for doing a sporting tour of South Africa, especially in the aftermath of such a brutal and gruesome massacre. The IOC refused to expel them. So the African and Caribbean players refused to participate in this Olympics. And you see images of Kenyan athletes who are leaving the Games. For the South African government, sport in general and rugby in particular signified a projection of white cultural nationalism and superiority. One observer explained, "The Springboks were the paragons of their society, white guardians and standard bearers of their way of life. For them, in the face of growing criticism from the outside world, every Springbok victory over New Zealand, Australia, France, England, Ireland, or Wales validated their political system, and at the heart of it, themselves. Rugby, it was said, was the national party at play," end quote. And the national party is the party of apartheid in South Africa. So, circumventing these international bans, British, Irish, Australian, New Zealand, and United States sporting leagues scheduled tours anyway. These matches became cataclysmic sites of anti-apartheid protest in which Black activists duly targeted the rogue sporting bodies and domestic conditions of colonialism, racism, and sexism. The first place that the Springboks went was to the UK and Ireland, where Sandrock and the Stop the Tour movement organized protests to picket the Games. And here are some images for that, but I won't dwell on it for too long. When Brutus learned that Australia had scheduled a 1971 Springbok tour, he decided to make the trip from Chicago. He began a speaker tour in Australia that electrified Australia's anti-apartheid activists to organize against the tour, and this especially inspired students. He condemned Australia's domestic colonialism against Aboriginals and its white Pacific imperialism. When the Springboks arrived to Australia in June of 1971, the Stop the Tour campaign was well underway. Sekai Holland, on the right, emerged as one of its leading spokespeople, and she was a Rhodesian graduate student at the time attending the University of New South Wales in 1971. Holland built relationships with Dennis Walker and Gary Foley, Aboriginal leaders in the anti-tour movement and in the emerging Australian Black Panther Party. Holland also met with Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, where she learned about the conditions of racial exploitation and the necessity of land sovereignty for Aboriginal workers. When the Springboks came to Sydney, Holland and the Aboriginal activists staged stunts at their hotel. Sekai and her white husband, Jim Holland, flaunted their interracial relationship in front of players, assuming that it would bother them, and they paraded hand in hand around the motel grounds. Gary Foley, who is all the way on the left, turned up outside of the hotel wearing a Springbok jersey. This was a sore sight for the actual Springbok players because South African Prime Minister John Vorster zealously declared that the Springbok jersey would never be profaned by a non-white. So in this comical and bold act of subversion, Gary Foley, Lynn Thompson, who was pregnant at the time, and Paul Coe solicited the press for a photo op in the green and gold jerseys. The anti-apartheid legacy in Australia was significant because it accelerated Aboriginal anti-colonial radicalism. Here's an image of a land rights demonstration led by some of the same members of the anti-tour movement. You can see Sekai holding a sign in the top left that says Aboriginal Land Now. After expulsions from Commonwealth countries, the International Cricket Council, the Olympics, and the Davis Cup, thanks to African Americans demonstrating in Tennessee, the South African teams had virtually nowhere left to play by the end of the 1970s. The ban was effective for nearly a decade until the South African Rugby Union procured invitations for a match series in New Zealand and in the United States. In New Zealand, the anti-tour movement brought together Maori struggles against apartheid and domestic racism. In the first Springbok match, women led the most militant acts of sabotage. A group of Maori women drove a Land Rover onto a stadium, through stadium fencing, and scattered glass all over the pitch to prevent people from playing. They also threw tacks and all kinds of stuff onto the pitch to make it dangerous to play. Maori women's leadership in the anti-tour movement transformed two women in particular, Donna Awatare and Rebecca Evans, two people on the right, into the public faces of radicalism in the country. And the demonstrations moved their organization, which was called Natamator, into the national political fray. Awatare explained the dual function of her anti-apartheid activism. The tour was an opportunity to signal to people in South Africa that we, Maori people, were with them in their struggle, but also to signal to New Zealand that there are issues here at home that need to be dealt with, end quote. So the Black Pacific's vigorous stance against apartheid found extended life in African America, where the South African team traveled next. Anti-apartheid activists organized in the Stop the Apartheid Rugby Tour Coalition, SART, fought to cancel matches in Chicago, Albany, and New York City. And their coalition brought together regional anti-apartheid groups, civil rights, and sporting organizations in a campaign to stop the tour, but also to disrupt the Reagan administration's constructive engagement with apartheid. While the Springboks were in New Zealand, SART's New York chapter successfully convinced Mayor Edward Koch to revoke their access to public stadiums before the match. And the reason I'm showing these pictures of the New Zealand protest is because U.S. activists were actually watching what was going on in New Zealand. And I found these documents in the Chicago activists archive, but they're clearly looking at what's going on in New Zealand and thinking about adapting these strategies from when the Springboks arrived in Chicago and Albany and New York. So this campaign, this U.S. campaign, won the support of the African liberation organizations who helped folks organize in New York and Illinois. Former Jamaican Prime Minister Michael Manley warned Reagan that morally and practically, it would be best to cancel the U.S. tour to avoid future boycotts. Los Angeles Mayor Tom Bradley pressured New York and Illinois mayors to also cancel the tours because the OAU had issued a boycott of all sporting events in the U.S. following the tour's announcement. 51 countries, most of them African, threatened to sit out of the 1984 Olympics to be held in Los Angeles. So Chicago's SART initiated mail, telegram, and phone campaigns to demand that city officials deny the Springboks access to public facilities. Sandrock, still led by Dennis Brutus, who was still a professor at Northwestern at this time, endorsed the coalition. Lisa Brock, a co-convener and spokeswoman for Chicago's SART, organized a rally and march from Federal City Plaza to the South African consulate on September 12, 1981. The 12th of September marked 1 week before the Springboks were scheduled to play in Chicago. And in anti-apartheid movement memory, it commemorated Stephen Biko's life and death. And Stephen Biko was the Black consciousness leader who was tortured and murdered by South African police. Chicago politicians Gus Savage and Danny Davis, who had successfully barred the Springboks from using public fields, spoke at this rally. They were joined by others who were mentioned on the flyer on the left: Lou Myers, Dennis Brutus, Joan Elbert, and Harold Rogers. SART planned to organize rally-goers for a protest at the game site on September 19th. A rally was also scheduled at Reverend Jeremiah Wright's Trinity Church of Christ the day before the match. The campaign drew organizers from all of Chicago's sides, a constellation of activist networks, their interests converging around labor, civil rights, and anti-imperialism. Longtime Black United Front founder Conrad Worrell, seeking to organize Black Chicagoans, made a special appeal as spokesman for the Black Coalition against the rugby tour. He noted that the white racist supremacist arrogance of apartheid was not limited to South Africa alone. The resurgence of the Nazi Party, the Ku Klux Klan, and the return of what he called certain code words in national parlance under the Reagan administration indicated that fascism was ascendant in the so-called land of liberty. This was more acutely expressed in a map that the Chicago Lions rugby team circulated in advance of a previous visit by another South African team, the Old Edwardians. The map depicted golf courses, fields, bars, nightclubs, and famous locations such as Lake Michigan, Wrigley Field, the Sears Tower, and the Hancock Building. But it also highlighted Chicago's Cabrini Green projects with a note that read, "Humans not welcome." And you can see that on the left. The SART coalition seized on the racist caption that dehumanized impoverished Black people living in Chicago's public housing and argued that apartheid South Africa was in Chicago. When the South African team arrived, Chicago organizers scrambled to uncover the match's undisclosed location. So organizers didn't know where the match was going to be held because it was being kept a secret. Reverend Jesse Jackson, leading 75 people of Operation Push, demonstrated in front of the Chicago Athletic Club where the Springboks stayed. They prepared to bus demonstrators from downtown Chicago to wherever the hidden game site was once they figured out where it was. It wasn't until well into the match and the match had started that a busload of SART demonstrators arrived at a public field in a predominantly Black neighborhood on the south side of Racine, Wisconsin, a city 75 miles north of Chicago. So this is where the match ended up being held. They were joined by some of Racine's enraged Black residents like Joe Harris, a job counselor. Harris was disgusted that sponsoring organizations allowed the game to be played in the industrial town. Racine's Black demonstrators and SART protesters stopped the match temporarily by marching onto the field with makeshift signs. Harris and others were arrested for disrupting the game, resentful that their taxpayer dollars supported apartheid. SART followed the Springboks to O'Hare Airport, where a couple of activists were arrested on the tarmac while, quote, giving one last boo for the departing team, end quote, as a reporter recounted. SART Chicago ultimately claimed victory for forcing the Springboks underground in this episode of anti-apartheid sports activism. But the last leg of the Springbok tour ended with a bang. Anti-apartheid supporters planted an explosive device at the Eastern Rugby Union's headquarters in Schenectady, causing $50,000 in damages. Despite the explosion, authorities were not compelled to cancel the match. At least 2,000 SART and Capital City Anti-Apartheid Coalition demonstrators picketed the match in the pouring rain with signs demanding Black majority rule in South Africa. 2 days later, unknown apartheid opponents bombed a rugby club in Evansville, Indiana, causing thousands in damages, and that's to the right. The Springboks might have won every match they played in the US, but activists had forced them to play secret games in unaccommodating circumstances that strengthened anti-apartheid organizing and stirred public disapproval of Reagan's foreign policy. The young organizer and historian in training, Robin D.G. Kelly, writing for UCLA's Ufahamu, extolled the importance of keeping our goals in perspective. The tumultuous and confrontational international campaign to stop the Springboks was one tactic for actualizing, quote, the total liberation of South Africa and the rest of the world from the fetters of racism and capitalism, end quote. On the eve of the 1984 Los Angeles Olympics, organizers mobilized a concurrent strategy, one that sought to force institutional divestment from apartheid. The student anti-apartheid movement, which I've written about in these places, enacted the global local organizing praxis of the sports boycott. Calling for divestment, it executed what Robin Kelly called, quote, our historical task, tied to our liberation here in the US, is to weaken the imperialist link from within. And so here's some places I've written about that, and perhaps we can talk about that in the Q&A, but this is where the sports movement goes next. What is significant about all of this is that the strategies are still relevant today. The Palestinian BDS movement, which is modeled off of the anti-apartheid movement, particularly its isolation campaigns, praised African football players for their Palestinian liberation solidarity on the field in 2021 after an Israeli attack on Gaza, which killed 247 people. Reverend Jeremiah Wright's words, a child is dying in Soweto, could easily be a child is dying in Gaza, a child is dying in the Congo, a child is dying in Sudan, Haiti, Atlanta, and so on. So the global anti-apartheid movement teaches us that it is only when we embrace a broad Black internationalist framing of freedom and an organizing ethic that matches that can we really realize an end to colonialism, imperialism, and anti-Blackness, both locally and globally. So thank you for listening.
Dr. Finkelson is an associate professor of African and African American Studies at Washington University in St. Louis, where he teaches courses on Black social movements, intellectual history, and Black cultural production. His first book, Building the Black Arts Movement, Hoyt, Fuller, and the Cultural Politics of the 1960s, was generously supported by the Black Metropolis Research Consortium. Thank you, Dr. Ferguson. And was awarded the Anna Julia Cooper and CLR James Award for Outstanding Scholarly Publication by the National Council for Black Studies, and was a finalist for the Pauli Murray Book Prize in Black Intellectual History by the African American Intellectual History Society. He is currently working on a book on hip hop and public housing. So, Dr. Finderson, I am going to turn it over to you for the discussion and Q&A. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Zed. Can everyone hear me? Okay, cool. So first off, Amanda, I should say, this is an incredibly ambitious project. And so props to you for taking on something so big. It's not easy to do. But I had a few questions that I had prepared, but I did want to ask you before I dive into the questions. If you mind, can you tell us about how this chapter you presented on today fits into the larger project?
Sure, I'm happy to. And I know this well since I just put it all together. So this part of my book is kind of it's the middle of my book. So it's when I'm talking about solidarity within the Black diaspora with anti-apartheid. So the book begins with just kind of like the internal apartheid resistance and organizing that's centered around like South Africans who are in South Africa who are building an internal resistance to the apartheid state. And then the middle part of the book is really how, like, what places around the world kind of like pick up the issue, build solidarity practices around it, and try to like they're really trying to find their power. It's about people in the diaspora who are trying to find their power, and they're trying to figure out, okay, there's this international problem, but there are parallels where we live. So how can we organize around this? And we know that this is a problem of anti-Blackness globally. We know this is a problem of colonialism, a problem of imperialism. So what can we do locally and globally? So it's a story of people trying to find their power. So this chapter looks at sports, but there are other chapters that look at music, and the role of exiles, and then how the movement against apartheid is kind of like fitting into existing local traditions of organizing, whether it be Black power or civil rights or whatever you have like in the Caribbean. It's different, but yeah, sorry. So and then it goes off into the ways that the anti-apartheid movement wins, but it also loses, and how it becomes liberalized in the third part of the book. So thanks for that.
Awesome. That's actually really super helpful, and it kind of anticipates my next question to you. I wonder, because you're doing something that's super ambitious, telling a global history, right? And as scholars, we kind of are we find productive kind of thinking through ways of dividing the globe, whether we're talking about like the Black Atlantic, Black Pacific, so forth and so on, right? Even though we know that these like geographies are sites of like solidarity, exchange, so forth and so on. But I wonder, as somebody who's kind of studying this as a kind of global history, have you been able to identify ways that particular kind of parts of the globe contribute unique kind of methods or strategies of tactics that all add to the kind of larger anti-apartheid movement? I mean, particularly, I was thinking about towards the end of your presentation in the chapter I read, you talked about those bombings. And so I wonder if there are like different ways that, different places show up differently in this based on what's already happening in those sites. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I'm trying to think. So in the chapter where I discussed the Caribbean, it's like a lot of the local movements are critiquing the post-colonial Jamaican state, right? And so what activism there looks like, actually anti-apartheid is accepted by the government. It's not like they're not fighting Reagan to like get the government to just like acknowledge something basic about what is wrong with apartheid. Instead, like you have a progressive, government that supports the apartheid regime, that is against the apartheid regime and supports the liberation movement, and is willing to like do so at the UN and do so in places that matter. And so the people who are drawing critiques are using it to kind of, speak about the limits of talk about politics really, and talk about the limits of, the post-colonial state, to continue talking about color stratification and its correlation to power and wealth in Caribbean societies, as well as like neocolonialism. And anyway, so there's so I'm just rambling. What I'm saying is that yeah, so you see new things about different places within the Black world and kind of like where politics are. So it's like some people are fighting colonialism, for real colonialism, and they're fighting like white settlers and that type of thing. But other people are fighting like the, neocolonialism and the things that are more difficult to kind of trace. So it is a project that allows me to see all of that. And then the tactics are, changed based on what the global local fight or what the global local struggle is and who the enemy is. So in Jamaica, it's like the enemy isn't the government the way it is in the United States. It's not the state. I mean, it is the state, but it's not like trying to get the state to change its foreign policy. It's trying to get the state to pay attention to poor Black Jamaicans and stop policing them. And there's this big policing discourse going on adjacent to anti-apartheid. Sorry, so it's a long-winded way of saying, yeah. In terms of the bombings, so the sourcing, it's tricky because no one is actually going to take accountability for these bombings. Like the Black Revolutionary Assault Team takes accountability for a bombing of the South African Airways office in New York I think it's in 1971. That's the only like organization I've seen like claim that it was them. But even so, it's like, did someone call in and just say that or that organization did it? So like, it's kind of fishy about, and there was also bombing at LaGuardia Airport around the South Africa in the 1980s. So I feel like those really, really like insurgent radical moves it's like more tricky to kind of like untangle.
And then I was thinking, I know the chapter starts with Brutus, but one of the parts of the chapter I really liked a lot was the part about Sakai Holland. Is it Sakai? Am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. And then in the presentation, you also talked about the Maori women. And I wonder if there's, in the larger project, do you make an effort to kind of trace this also like, feminist lineage in this conversation? And the reason I ask is because even when you think about the US, the centrality of Black women in the anti-apartheid movement is really significant, right? So I wonder if that's also something you plan on taking up in the manuscript.
Oh, that's such a good question. Yes, sort of. So I work on Black consciousness women in England. So these are women who are part of the Black consciousness movement. And they're really like having disputes with a lot of white feminists in the anti-apartheid solidarity movement in Europe. What's interesting is that they're reading African American feminists. I don't get to talk much about it, but they're reading like Kambahi, like they're reading these things. And there are circulations. So for example, the Maori women, they go to a conference in Cuba in the 1970s, and they go there and they read Marx, but they also meet PLO women from the Palestinian liberation movement. And they're having these conversations about what it means to be in these organizations, to be like, like a woman liberator, but also be a mother. And so I don't really get into it, but it comes up. So I see it. So these things are there and the circulations are there, but I haven't kind of like put it all together.
Makes sense. That makes sense. I would just encourage you to do it because I think in some ways, as much as this is a global history, you're also doing some like really important feminist recovery work. And I would just encourage you to like hold on to that thread. Also, I wanted to ask you, and the audience could feel free to chime in with questions as well. But I also wanted to ask you, because you also closed on this kind of comparison with BDS. And so I was wondering if you, in looking at those two things in comparison, like what do you see as some of the strengths that you can kind of see coming out of the global anti-apartheid movement that BDS maybe hasn't taken up or maybe BDS has overlooked? Like, what are some of the things that made it so effective, in other words?
Oh, that's a good question. I'm not the most up to date on everything BDS is doing, but so it's hard for me to, yeah, it's hard for me to kind of say what they're not. So I think like because the Israeli state is just such is it's there. I will say the Israeli state and the apartheid state, they grew up together, as you show in your work too. They grew up together, right? There's an interpenetration between those states, especially like, I mean, I think of like so many of the South African white South Africans who fled South Africa when they feared that Black people were going to be able to vote, and they went to Israel. And then they, you know, there's this one group where they started like they started a kibbutz, and then the kibbutz they like created riot gear. And this is the riot gear that they would send to South Africa, that the South African police forces would wear when they're massacring Black children in the townships who are fighting for an end to apartheid. So these connections, there's nuclear connections, there's all types of connections that are there, right? But yeah, the Israeli state doesn't, as far as I know, doesn't really have a team that's traveling. Like, I don't know if like a sports boycott would be as effective. I think that using athletes using sporting spaces to consciousness raise, even though they're not actually like, boycotting Springboks, like actual Springbok players. I mean, not Springbok players, but Israeli players that, if we're drawing the parallel, could still be a useful thing, but sport is like less of an arena. I think what's difficult about the present moment is like really getting a handle on the intricacies of the financial connections and the financial ties between the US, I guess it would be like between the US and Israel, in the way that like people were able to get a hand on the ties between the US and South Africa in the BDS movement. But now, because like just the acceleration of finance capital has like changed so much since the 1980s, like there's less, and I'm thinking about divestment specifically, but there's like less just like mutual funds and all these things are so much more complicated, as opposed to having direct stocks invested in companies that are doing business in a place like apartheid South Africa. It's like now you have like these complex financial instruments, and trying to like untangle all of that to figure out how to divest and what to divest from, I think is probably a real challenge for the BDS movement today. But yeah, I would have to think more about like, yeah, what can be done. I will say that like the students who are being criminalized right now, and the students who are being attacked, yeah, there was similar violence. We remember it now as like, oh, the student anti-apartheid movement was this like wonderful movement where all these students built shanties, and it was great, and universities were on their side. And no, it wasn't like that. These universities were calling the police on these students. They were beating them up. There were students who were like, other students would firebomb like, protesting anti-apartheid students. There were like numerous injuries. I mean, these students were hated. And so we're seeing similar things now, unfortunately, and we're seeing universities come after these students. That was done also in '68, but also done during the anti-apartheid movement, where they even came after students in court. They like sued students in the '80s. Anyway, I'm getting far away from your question. I'm sorry.
It's good. I mean, this is all, I could talk about this all day, but I also want to make sure that audience members have an opportunity to ask questions. So I just wanted to open up to see if anyone had a question. If not, I have another one for you.
I'll ask a question. Thank you for your work, Dr. Hall. I would love to hear you talk about what brought you to this project. And then a more specific question is a photo you showed of the rugby team. And I noticed there was one person of African descent, like phenotypically African. So I was really curious about that.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take the second question first. Thank you, Dr. Dennis. When South Africa started getting banned everywhere, they decided that they were going to kind of like liberalize a little bit, and that they were going to put maybe like 1 or 2 Black or colored players on their team to make it seem like, we're integrated. But so anyway, so it's pretty much like tokenism. I mean, like it was just like they just decided to put these people there to try to say that they were progressing and being progressive. But the reality was is that apartheid was still intact. And, this was just to allow them to like try to get through some of these international bans. So the picture that you saw was from I think it was like a 1990, I think it's like a 1991 team of the Springboks. And the reason I wanted to show that picture was because it was in color, so you could actually see the color of their jerseys and everything. But yeah, so that's what that was. And actually Dennis Brutus himself, he was like, we need to be wary, like be aware that just because they have some colored and they have some like African players on the team does not mean that we need to like lessen or reduce our isolation. So that was that with trying to think about anything else to say about that. And then I came to this project. I was telling Dr. Fenderson earlier. Yeah, it was like I was really interested in global movements. I was like watching the Arab Spring, I think, and fascinated with how like this was at the time when I thought that there was like, there was like more tech utopia. So like, it was like there was promise for like technology to help liberate us from our circumstances and promise for organizing across like social media and all these things. This is back in like 2010. Okay. I'm watching the Arab Spring happening, all this stuff. And my advisor, Sam Roberts at Columbia, was like, well, maybe you should think about like, a pre-internet global movement. And I was like, oh yeah. And he was like, anti-apartheid is a great example. Because I also wanted to do something that was organized around racial justice in a global context. So I did that. And that's kind of like how I got here. But I think part of it was like, I was on some Gil Scott-Heron stuff that's like, the internet will not save us. The revolution will not be televised. Like the internet's not going to like organize for us. So yeah, I was just interested in how those dynamics kind of like unfolded across space, like vast space, when we're thinking about social justice globally. And and then later that summer, I went to Palestine and I saw the apartheid wall, and that gave me my first understanding of apartheid, but it put a lot more questions in my mind, more so like, wait, is this what apartheid was, or was it something else? And then of course I had to go read and learn more and do all of that. So that is the story of the project.
I think Dr. Sutton has a question.
Yeah, Dr. Hall, you seem to have collected amassed quite a bit in your summer. Not to say you're just starting this in the summer, but tell us a little bit about where among the BMRC collections that you sort of targeted, and I don't know, maybe you still need to come back.
Oh yeah.
For a second round, but it just seems like a lot, and I'm just curious about that and about where you.
Yeah, no, I most certainly need to come back. I'm from Chicago, and I just regret not having started in these archives when I was a high school student at Whitty Young, because there is so much stuff. Heidi Marshall was like tremendously helpful to me at Columbia College. And she's also a great person to talk to about anti-apartheid, but she just has, there's just so many unprocessed collections there that she opened up for me and let me see. And so there is so much just at Columbia. I could have spent the whole time there, but I also worked in the Northwestern repositories where like all of Dennis Brutus's papers are, and they're robust there as well. And I think he has stuff in Mayabuye in Cape Town as well. He must have a lot as well. So yeah, there I was in Herskovitz, which actually had like these OAU like minutes from like the first OAU founding documents was at Herskovitz. And I was like, okay, this is great. I did stuff at Harold Washington Library as well, which this is more for my like reggae chapter, but like there's a lot of material there that has to do with reggae. There's like the reggae, there's like a big reggae also like the Caribbean, like South Side is something that I feel like needs investigation. If someone's looking, but like there were all of these like small record stores on the south side of Chicago, and I never, knew. I don't think they exist as much anymore, but there's these periodicals at the Harold Washington Library that kind of like tracks that stuff. So yeah, and then I would love to come back and get into the Vivian Harsh collections, because there's just robust and ample stuff there for me, but I wasn't able to get into the ones that I was hoping to see yet for this summer. But I'm always in Chicago, so hopefully we can come back and look into those. But again, like it's just really nice to see like an international Chicago come to life in the archives. In ways that, even being from Chicago, it's like, I don't think of it as being like hyper international, but, I got into those archives and I'm like, wow, so many people and activists were really thinking really, in a broad international framework. The collections at the Harsh, I have a list that I sent. I think they were closed when we went back and forth with Allison, but I can't remember off the top of my head what I was looking at, what I was hoping to see, but I can get back to you about that.
Right. It sounds like you touched a lot, and we need to be sure that you're in touch with Raquel Flores Clemens, who heads the archives over there at the Harsh, and we can look, if you decide to come back and look a little further. But it's just so good to hear the help that you got, the things that you saw and presented to us today and shared with us. The documentation was, amazing, and the whole, the focus of your research. I'm very interested in. I know this is for one chapter, so I am very interested in your book. So you must keep in touch with us.
Absolutely.
All right. Well. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your research, Dr. Hall. We really do appreciate it. And there's a few comments about the great presentation and et cetera in the chat, and the interest level is high. So we do look forward to hearing from you again, hopefully. And Dr. Fenderson, thank you too for joining us today. Appreciate it.
And thank you everyone for coming. Thank you, Dr. Fenderson, for your comments. And Allison, thank you for just bringing us through the entire summer. We had everything we needed.
Oh, of course, you're welcome. And I'm happy to see some faces of some fellows on today, past and current, in support of your research as well. And Jonathan, thank you. You're always supportive of BMRC. Jonathan was a fellow some years back. I think it was 2012.
Yeah, it may have even been earlier than that, but I love BMRC, so if I can ever be helpful, you let me know.
Oh, and you have been. Thank you so much. Of course, I'll stay in touch with you. And you keep us posted on the book on hip hop as well.